The autumn wind cut through the streets of Tombstone, Arizona like a blade, carrying with it the dust and dreams of 1,000 broken promises. Victoria Whitmore stepped down from the stagecoach, her full skirts catching on the rough wooden step. As she struggled to maintain her dignity, the leather valise in her hand contained everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a single photograph of the parents she'd lost to cholera 5 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the crowd gathered around the depot. Somewhere among these weathered faces was supposed to be Edmund Hartwell, the cattle rancher who had placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald, seeking a sturdy wife of good moral character. His letter had been brief but promising: seeking companionship on my ranch outside Tombstone. Must be hardworking and willing to embrace frontier life. Will provide comfort and security in return for loyalty and dedication. Victoria had memorized every word of that letter during the 3-week journey west. She had clung to it through the endless, bone-jarring miles across prairies and mountains, through sleepless nights in uncomfortable way stations, through the growing dread that maybe she was making the biggest mistake of her life. But what choice had she really had? Her position as a seamstress in Mrs. Pemberton's shop in Boston had barely paid enough for her tiny room in the boarding house, and the other girls there whispered constantly about her figure, calling her that big girl behind cupped hands. Now, standing in the blazing Arizona sun with sweat already beading on her brow, Victoria felt every eye in the depot boring into her. A group of cowboys lounging against the hitching post exchanged knowing looks, their gazes traveling up and down her ample form with undisguised amusement. One of them, a lanky man with a tobacco-stained mustache, elbowed his companion and muttered something that made them both snicker. "Excuse me, miss." The voice belonged to the station master, a thin man with kind eyes and graying hair. "Are you waiting for someone in particular?" Victoria's throat felt dry as desert sand. "Yes, sir, Mr. Edmund Hartwell. He was supposed to meet me here. I'm—" She paused, the words sticking in her throat like thorns. "I'm his intended bride." The station master's expression grew puzzled. He scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Hartwell, you say?" "Can't say I know that name, miss. Been working at this depot for nearly 15 years, and I know most of the ranchers." "Hereabouts." A cold stone settled in Victoria's stomach. "Perhaps he's been delayed. His ranch is outside of town." "Could be," the station master said, though his tone suggested he doubted it. "Why don't you have a seat on the bench there, and I'll ask around. Someone's bound to know him if he's got a spread in these parts." Victoria nodded gratefully and made her way to the weathered wooden bench beside the depot building. The cowboys. Conversation had grown louder, apparently emboldened by her obvious distress. "Look at the size of that one," the mustached cowboy said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Reckon whoever ordered her got more than he bargained for." His companion, a younger man with sun-bleached hair, laughed cruelly. "Maybe that's why he ain't show up." Took one look and headed for the hills. Victoria's cheeks burned with shame, but she kept her eyes fixed on her hands, folded tightly in her lap. She had endured worse back in Boston, but somehow it felt more brutal here in this unforgiving landscape, where she was utterly alone and defenseless. The minutes crawled by like hours. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into a shimmering furnace that made her heavy traveling dress feel like a punishment. Other passengers from the stage had been met by family or friends and had long since disappeared into the town. New arrivals came and went, but still there was no sign of Edmund Hartwell. As the afternoon wore on, the station master returned with increasingly grim news. He'd asked at the saloons, the general store, even the sheriff's office. No one had heard of Edmund Hartwell or any ranch bearing his name. With each negative report, Victoria felt another piece of her hope crumble away. "I'm real sorry, miss," the station master said finally, his voice heavy with sympathy. "But I'm starting to think this fellow might not exist. We've had problems before with men placing false advertisements. They get cold feet, or they were never serious to begin with." Victoria's world tilted on its axis. The careful plan she'd built, the future she'd imagined, the escape from her lonely life in Boston, all of it was collapsing like a house of cards in a windstorm. She felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of these strangers who were already watching her like she was some kind of spectacle. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, more to herself than to the station master. The cowboys had apparently grown bored with their cruel entertainment and had wandered off. But Victoria could see other people stealing glances at her, the woman alone on the bench, with her single valise, obviously abandoned. She could practically hear their thoughts. "Poor thing. What kind of man would leave a woman like that stranded?" As evening approached, the depot began to empty. The last of the day's business was concluded, and the station master began closing up his office. Victoria realized with growing panic that she would soon be alone in this strange town with nowhere to go and precious little money in her purse. "There's a boarding house about 2 blocks down," the station master offered gently. "Mrs. Patterson runs a clean place. She might give you a room for the night while you figure out what to do next." Victoria nodded numbly and gathered her belongings. Each step away from the depot felt like walking away from the last vestige of her dreams. The boarding house was a 2-story adobe building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Patterson's Lodging." Clean beds, honest meals. The proprietress, a sturdy woman with graying brown hair and shrewd but not unkind eyes, looked Victoria up and down with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up potential trouble. "You'll be wanting a room, I expect," Mrs. Patterson said. "Yes, ma'am. Just for tonight, I hope." Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. $1.50, includes breakfast. Payment in advance." Victoria reached into her small purse and counted out the coins with trembling fingers. It was more than she could afford. But what choice did she have? She couldn't sleep in the street. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered by a faded quilt and a wash basin on a wooden stand. A single window looked out over the dusty main street of Tombstone, where lantern light was beginning to flicker in the gathering dusk. Victoria set her valise on the bed and finally allowed herself to truly absorb what had happened. She had come all this way 3 weeks of uncomfortable travel, spending nearly all her savings on the train and stage tickets for nothing. Worse than nothing. She was stranded in a frontier town where she knew no one, with barely enough money to survive a week. The job at Mrs. Pemberton's shop was surely gone by now, given to some other girl who needed work. Her tiny room at the boarding house in Boston had probably been rented to someone else. The tears came then, hot and bitter, flowing down her cheeks like the rain she wished would come to wash away this nightmare. She had been so careful, so practical in her correspondence with Edmund Hartwell. She had been honest about her appearance, describing herself as full-figured but strong, and he had seemed pleased by her forthright nature. His letters, though, few had been encouraging. He'd spoken of his ranch, his cattle, his need for a partner who could handle the demands of frontier life. Had it all been lies? Had he taken some perverse pleasure in luring a desperate woman across the country only to abandon her? Or had he simply changed his mind when faced with the reality of what he'd done? Victoria wiped her eyes with her handkerchief and tried to think practically. She could use what little money she had left to buy passage back east, but to what? She had no family, no close friends, no job waiting for her. The few relatives she had left had made it clear that they considered her a burden, a spinster with no prospects who was better off fending for herself. She could try to find work here in Tombstone, but what kind of work was available for a woman alone on the frontier? The options were limited and mostly unpalatable. She had heard whispered conversations among the other passengers about the kinds of establishments that employed unattached women in mining towns. A knock at her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Mrs. Patterson stood in the hallway with a tray bearing a simple meal, bread, cheese, and a bowl of what looked like beef stew. "Figured you might be hungry," the older woman said gruffly. "Didn't see you come down for supper." Victoria was surprised by the kindness. I don't have money for meals beyond what's included with the room." Mrs. Patterson waved dismissively. "This one's on the house. You look like you've had a hard day." "Thank you," Victoria managed, accepting the tray gratefully. "Mrs. Patterson, might I ask ... are there opportunities for work here? For a woman?" The proprietress studied her with those shrewd eyes. "Depends on what kind of work you're willing to do, and what kind of woman you are. There's always the saloons, but I don't reckon that's what you're after." Victoria shook her head quickly. "Could try the hotel. They sometimes need girls for cleaning and laundry. Or maybe the schoolmaster's wife could use help with the children. But I'll be honest with you, child, this is a hard place for a woman alone. Most of the decent work goes to women with husbands to vouch for them." After Mrs. Patterson left, Victoria sat on the edge of the narrow bed and ate the simple meal, though she could barely taste it. Through the thin walls of the boarding house, she could hear the sounds of Tombstone after dark raucous laughter from the saloons, the occasional shout or gunshot, the clip-clop of horses' hooves on the dusty street. This was to have been the beginning of her new life, her chance at happiness and security. Instead, it felt like the end of everything. She thought of the long journey that had brought her here, of the hope that had sustained her through every uncomfortable mile. She remembered the other passengers' curious glances when she'd spoken proudly of her intended husband, of the future she'd planned to build in this wild land. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How foolish she had been to believe that someone would actually want her, would see past her unfashionable figure to the person beneath. In Boston, she had been invisible except as an object of quiet ridicule. Here, she was simply another abandoned woman, another casualty of the harsh realities of frontier life. As she prepared for bed, Victoria caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Her face was flushed and swollen from crying, her dark hair escaping from its careful arrangement. She saw what everyone else saw: a large woman, plain and unremarkable, the kind of person who inspired pity at best and mockery at worst. But somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of hurt and humiliation, a small flame of defiance still flickered. She had survived the loss of her parents, the loneliness of her life in Boston, the hardships of the journey west. She was stronger than she looked, more resilient than anyone gave her credit for. Tomorrow, she will find a way forward. She had. 2. The night sounds of Tombstone gradually faded as Victoria finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, her hand still clutching the photograph of her parents. In her dreams, she walked endlessly down dusty roads that led nowhere, searching for something she could never quite name, while behind her, voices whispered and laughed at her retreating figure. She had come west looking for love and found only disappointment. But perhaps, in this harsh and unforgiving land, she might yet discover something even more valuable: the strength to stand on her own. Curves and all. Dawn broke over Tombstone with the harsh clarity of desert light, flooding Victoria's small room with golden rays that seemed to mock her circumstances. She had slept fitfully, waking several times to the unfamiliar sounds of a frontier town, settling into night-distant music from the saloons, the occasional bark of a dog, and once, what sounded like breaking glass followed by angry shouting. Victoria, dressed carefully in her simplest traveling dress, a dark blue cotton that had seen better days, but was still respectable. She braided her thick brown hair and pinned it into a practical knot at the base of her neck. If she was going to face this strange new world, she would do so with whatever dignity she could muster. Mrs. Patterson's promised breakfast turned out to be hearty fair eggs, thick slices of bacon, and biscuits with honey. Victoria ate mechanically, her mind already racing through the limited options before her. She had exactly $3.47 left to her name, enough for perhaps 2 more nights at the boarding house if she was careful about meals. Sleep any better? Mrs. Patterson asked, refilling Victoria's coffee cup with strong bitter brew that made her eyes water. Some, thank you. Victoria hesitated, then pressed forward. Mrs. Patterson, yesterday you mentioned the hotel might need help. Could you tell me more about that? The older woman settled into the chair across from Victoria, her expression thoughtful. The Desert Rose Hotel, down on Allen Street. It's the fanciest place in town, caters mostly to businessmen and the occasional traveling family. Mrs. Donovan runs it with an iron fist, but she's fair enough if you work hard. They go through laundry girls pretty regular. It's hard work in this heat. Victoria nodded eagerly. Do you think she might see me today? Worth a try. But I'll warn you, she's particular about her girls. Likes them neat and proper, no nonsense. And the pay isn't much, maybe $8 a week if you're lucky. $8 a week. Victoria quickly calculated in her head. It would barely cover her room and board, with nothing left over for emergencies or the eventual journey home. But it was something, at least a foothold in this bewildering place. After breakfast, Victoria gathered her courage and made her way down Allen Street. Tombstone in the morning light was a revelation of contradictions. The main thoroughfare bustled with activity freight wagons rumbling past loaded supplies, well-dressed businessmen in tailored suits walking alongside grizzled prospectors in patched overalls, ladies in fine dresses picking their way carefully around mud puddles and horse droppings. The buildings themselves told the story of a town caught between wilderness and civilization. Elegant establishments with glass windows and painted signs stood next to rough-hewn structures that looked like they'd been thrown together with whatever materials were at hand. The Desert Rose Hotel was clearly among the former, a 2-story brick building with ornate ironwork balconies and a sign painted in gilt letters. Victoria paused outside, smoothing her skirts and checking her reflection in the hotel's front window. Her heart hammered as she pushed through the heavy wooden doors into the lobby. The interior was surprisingly elegant, with polished wooden floors, burgundy velvet chairs, and an enormous chandelier that caught and scattered the morning light. Into tiny rainbows behind the front desk stood a woman who could only be Mrs. Donovan. She was perhaps 50 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe chignon and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her black dress was expensive but practical, and she moved with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to command. Yes? Mrs. Donovan's voice was crisp, neither welcoming nor dismissive. Good morning, ma'am. I'm Victoria Whitmore. I was told you might have work available for someone willing to do laundry and cleaning. Those sharp blue eyes swept over Victoria from head to toe, taking in her neat but obviously well-worn dress, her carefully arranged hair, her nervous but determined expression. Experience? I worked for a seamstress in Boston for 3 years. I'm accustomed to careful handling of fine fabrics and attention to detail. Seamstress work is different from hotel laundry, Miss Whitmore. The washing here is hard, hot work. 12-hour days, 6 days a week. The customers expect their linen spotless and their rooms immaculate. Can you manage that? Victoria straightened her shoulders. Yes, ma'am. I'm stronger than I might appear. Mrs. Donovan's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. I can see that. Very well. $7 a week to start, meals included. If you prove yourself satisfactory, we'll discuss an increase after a month. Can you begin today? Relief flooded through Victoria so powerfully that she felt momentarily dizzy. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. Follow me. Mrs. Donovan led Victoria through a door behind the front desk and down a narrow corridor that opened into the hotel's working areas. The kitchen was a symphony of controlled chaos, with 2 cooks preparing for the noon meal while a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 scrubbed pots at a deep stone sink. Beyond that was the laundry room, and Victoria's heart sank as she saw what awaited her. The space was dominated by enormous copper tubs set over fire pits, already steaming with hot water. Piles of soiled linens towered in corners, and the air was thick with humidity and the sharp smell of lye soap. 2 women were already at work, their faces flushed with heat and exertion as they scrubbed stained sheets against washboards. "Maria, Elena, this is Victoria. She'll be working with you starting today." Mrs. Donovan's introduction was brief and to the point. "Victoria, Maria will show you what to do. The noon linens need to be finished by 3 o'clock." The 2 laundresses looked up from their work, and Victoria felt her stomach clench as she saw their expressions. Maria, a woman of perhaps 40 with graying hair and tired eyes, nodded politely enough. But Elena, younger and prettier with glossy black hair and suspicious dark eyes, looked Victoria up and down with obvious skepticism. "She's awfully big," Elena said to Maria in a stage whisper, as if Victoria couldn't hear every word. "Think she can keep up?" Maria shot her companion a warning look. "We'll see soon enough. Come, Victoria. I'll show you how we do things here." The work was indeed as brutal as Mrs. Donovan had warned. Victoria's hands were soon raw from the harsh soap and scalding water. Her back ached from bending over the washboards, and sweat poured down her face despite the bandana Maria had given her to tie around her hair. The hotel's linens had to meet exacting standards. Every stain scrubbed out, every wrinkle pressed smooth with heavy irons heated on the faioway stove. Elena made no effort to hide her displeasure with the new arrangement. She worked with theatrical efficiency, making sure Victoria noticed how quickly she could finish a load of washing or how expertly she could maneuver the heavy baskets of wet linens. When Victoria struggled with a particularly stubborn stain on a tablecloth, Elena was quick to point it out. "Mrs. Donovan won't tolerate sloppy work," she said with false concern. "Maybe this isn't the right job for you." But Victoria had endured worse than Elena's petty cruelty. She gritted her teeth and kept working, determined to prove that she belonged here. Maria, she noticed, said little but occasionally offered quiet advice: which soap worked best on bloodstains, how to get wrinkles out of delicate fabric without tearing it as the day wore on. Victoria began to understand the rhythm of the work. There was a certain satisfaction in taking something soiled and making it clean again, in the transformation from chaos to order. Her muscles protested, but they gradually adapted to the repetitive motions. More importantly, she found that her size, which had always been a source of shame, was actually an advantage here. She could lift the heavy baskets that made Elena struggle, could work for hours without the fatigue that obviously plagued the smaller woman. The hotel's customers provided a constant stream of fascination and sometimes dismay. Victoria caught glimpses of them through the kitchen door as they came and went, wealthy merchants in fine suits, women dressed in the latest Eastern fashions, occasionally a family with children whose excited voices carried through the building. One incident in particular burned itself into Victoria's memory. A well-dressed couple arrived for luncheon, the woman in an elaborate green silk dress that must have cost more than Victoria made in a year. As they were shown to their table, Victoria overheard the woman's comment to her companion: "I don't know why they allow such coarse-looking people to work where guests might see them. That large girl in the kitchen is positively unsightly." Victoria's face flamed with humiliation, but she forced herself to keep working. Elena, who had heard the comment as well, shot Victoria a meaningful look. "Some people just don't know their place," she said loud enough for the departing customers to hear. Afternoon brought new challenges. A traveling salesman complained loudly about stains on his shirt, demanding that it be re-washed immediately. Mrs. Donovan inspected the garment with the intensity of a general reviewing troops, then handed it to Victoria. "This is your responsibility now," she said simply. "Fix it." Victoria worked on that shirt for nearly an hour, trying soap after soap, scrubbing gently but persistently until finally the stains began to fade. When she presented the finished garment to Mrs. Donovan, the hotel owner examined it carefully before giving a curt nod of approval. "Satisfactory," was all she said. But Victoria felt as if she'd won a great victory. As evening approached and the workday finally ended, Victoria's entire body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible. Her hands were raw and swollen, her back screamed with every movement, and she was soaked through with sweat despite the cooling desert air. But she had survived her first day, and more importantly, she had earned it. Maria walked with her partway back to the boarding house, her manner friendlier now that they were away from Elena's critical gaze. "You did well today," she said quietly. "Better than Elena expected, I think. She doesn't seem to like me much." Maria shrugged. "Elena doesn't like anyone who might take attention away from her. She's been after Mrs. Donovan to promote her to working the front desk, but..." She glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard. "Mrs. Donovan says she's too flighty. Elena thinks it's because she's Mexican, but really it's because she spends more time worrying about her appearance than her work." Victoria nodded, filing this information away. Understanding the dynamics of her new workplace would be crucial to survival. "The work gets easier," Maria continued. "Your hands will toughen up, and you'll learn which customers are worth worrying about and which ones just like to complain. Mrs. Donovan is fair, but she expects results. Show her you can be relied upon, and she'll take care of you." Back at the boarding house, Victoria climbed the stairs to her room on shaking legs. Mrs. Patterson took one look at her and sent up a basin of warm water and some salve for her hands. The kindness brought tears to Victoria's eyes. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed even such small gestures of care. As she soaked her aching hands and tried to work out the knots in her shoulders, Victoria took stock of her situation. The work was brutal, but it was honest employment that would allow her to support herself. She had found her footing, however precarious, in this strange new world. But as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the memory of that woman's cruel comment about her appearance, or Elena's obvious determination to see her fail. She was no longer in immediate danger of starvation or homelessness, but she was still very much alone, still an outsider trying to find her place in a world that seemed determined to remind her that she didn't quite fit. Tomorrow would bring another day of scalding water and harsh soap, of Elena's subtle sabotage and customers' casual cruelty. But it would also bring another $7 closer to what? Victoria wasn't sure yet. All she knew was that she had survived her first day in the working world of Tombstone, and that would have to be enough for now. Through her small window, she could see the lights of the town twinkling in the darkness, each one representing lives and dreams and struggles she knew nothing about. Somewhere out there, perhaps, was a different future than the one she had planned. But for now, she would focus on simply making it through each day, one load of laundry at a time. 3 weeks had passed since Victoria began working at the Desert Rose Hotel, and the rhythm of her new life had settled into a predictable pattern of exhaustion and small victories. Her hands had developed calluses that protected against the harsh soap, and her back had grown accustomed to the constant bending and lifting. She had even managed to save a few dollars, carefully hidden in her room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. The relationship with Elena remained tense, marked by subtle acts of sabotage. Extra starch mysteriously added to delicate fabrics. Victoria's work assignments accidentally mixed up, and pointed comments about how much space Victoria took up in the cramped laundry room. But Maria had become a steady presence, offering guidance and occasionally sharing stories of her own journey. From a small village in Sonora to the bustling frontier town of Tombstone. It was on a particularly busy Thursday morning that Victoria's carefully constructed routine was shattered by an unexpected encounter. The hotel was preparing for the arrival of a cattle buyers' convention, which meant mountains of extra linens and Mrs. Donovan's standards elevated to an almost impossible level of perfection. Victoria was struggling to maneuver a large basket of wet sheets toward the drying lines behind the hotel when disaster struck. The basket's bottom gave way without warning, sending clean linens tumbling into the dusty alley. Victoria stared in horror at the mess, hours of work ruined, and she could already imagine Mrs. Donovan's reaction. "Looks like you could use some help." The voice was deep and quiet, with a slight drawl that spoke of Texas or perhaps New Mexico. Victoria looked up to see a tall man dismounting from a paint horse, his weathered face shaded by a wide-brimmed hat. He was perhaps 35 years old, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of sage and morning light. His clothes were practical denim pants, a cotton shirt, and worn leather chaps that spoke of long hours in the saddle. "Oh no, please don't trouble yourself," Victoria said quickly, already kneeling to gather the scattered linens. "I can manage." But the stranger was already moving, his long stride covering the distance between them in seconds. Without ceremony, he began collecting sheets and pillowcases, his movements efficient and careful. Victoria noticed that his hands, though obviously accustomed to hard work, handled the delicate fabrics with surprising gentleness. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said as they worked together to salvage what they could. "And you look like someone who's had one of those days where everything that can go wrong does." Despite her embarrassment, Victoria found herself almost smiling. "Victoria Whitmore, and you're quite right about the day. Jake Morrison." The name stirred something in Victoria's memory. She had heard the hotel guests mention it in passing, always with a tone of respect that bordered on reverence. He owned one of the largest ranches in the territory, she recalled, and was known for his fairness in business dealings and his ability to handle trouble. "This your regular job?" Jake asked, helping her transfer the salvageable linens to a new basket he had produced from somewhere. "For now," Victoria admitted, then wondered why she had been so honest with a complete stranger. Jake studied her for a moment, his green eyes thoughtful. "Seems like hard work for someone who's obviously educated. You talk like you've had some schooling." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sometimes circumstances don't allow us to choose our work, Mr. Morrison." "True enough," he said simply, without the pity or judgment she had come to expect from others. "I headed into the hotel to see Mrs. Donovan about catering a gathering. I'm planning. Mind if I put in a good word about your help here? Might smooth things over when you have to explain about the basket." The offer was so unexpected and kind, Victoria felt tears prick her eyes. "That's very generous of you, but I couldn't ask." "You're not asking, I'm offering." Jake's tone was matter-of-fact, as if helping stranded laundry girls was something he did regularly. "Besides, Mrs. Donovan and I go way back. She listened to what I have to say." Before Victoria could protest further, Jake was striding toward the hotel's back entrance, leaving her to follow with the rescued linens. She watched through the kitchen doorway as he spoke quietly with Mrs. Donovan, his manner relaxed but somehow commanding. The hotel owner listened attentively, occasionally glancing toward Victoria with what looked like renewed interest. When Mrs. Donovan approached the laundry room a few minutes later, Victoria braced herself for a lecture about carelessness and damaged property. Instead, the older woman's expression was thoughtful. "Mr. Morrison tells me you handled a difficult situation with grace and efficiency," she said. "He was quite impressed with your composure under pressure." Victoria blinked in surprise. "The basket breaking was hardly graceful, Mrs. Donovan." "No, but your response to it was. Mr. Morrison specifically mentioned your concern for salvaging the hotel's property and your willingness to take responsibility." Mrs. Donovan paused, studying Victoria with those sharp blue eyes. He also mentioned that you seem overqualified for laundry work. Heat flooded Victoria's face. She couldn't imagine what Jake Morrison thought he was doing, calling attention to her situation. I'm grateful for the work you've given me. Mrs. Donovan, I don't want you to think what I think. Mrs. Donovan interrupted. Is that perhaps it's time to consider expanding your duties? I've been needing someone to help with the front desk. During busy periods, someone who can speak well with guests and handle correspondence. The pay would be better, and it would make better use of your education. Victoria's heart leaped, but she forced herself to remain cautious. What about Alina? She's been wanting to work the front desk. Mrs. Donovan's expression grew dry. Elena is concerned primarily with Elena. You, on the other hand, have proven yourself reliable and hardworking. The position is yours if you want it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of training and adjustment. Mrs. Donovan personally instructed Victoria in the hotel's booking system, showed her how to handle guest complaints, and explained the delicate art of managing demanding customers. Victoria found herself energized by the mental challenges, the opportunity to use skills that had been dormant since her days in Boston. Elena's reaction to the promotion was predictably venomous. I suppose you think you're better than us now, she hissed during a brief break between guests. Just because some rich rancher took pity on you doesn't mean you belong at the front desk. Victoria met her gaze steadily. I intend to earn my place here, Alina, just as I did in the laundry room. But Alina's words stung more than Victoria cared to admit. Was that all Jake Morrison's kindness had been pity for the large, unfortunate woman struggling with menial labor? The thought made her cheeks burn with fresh shame. As evening approached and Victoria prepared to leave for the day, she was surprised to find Jake Morrison waiting in the hotel lobby. He had cleaned up since their morning encounter, his hair combed and his shirt changed, but he still carried himself with that easy confidence that seemed as natural as breathing. Heard congratulations are in order, he said, rising from one of the burgundy chairs as she approached. Mrs. Donovan tells me you'll be working the front desk now. Victoria paused, uncertain how to respond. I have you to thank for that, I believe, though I'm not sure why you involved yourself in my affairs. Jake's expression grew serious. May I buy you dinner, Miss Whitmore? There's a decent restaurant just down the street, and I'd like to explain myself properly. The invitation was so unexpected that Victoria could only stare at him. A gentleman asking her to dinner? It seemed impossible, like something from a dream she might have had years ago. I don't think that would be appropriate, Mr. Morrison. We barely know each other. Then let's remedy that, Jake said simply. I'm not in the habit of making improper suggestions, Miss Whitmore. I'm talking about a meal in a public restaurant, nothing more. Victoria found herself nodding before she had consciously decided to accept. There was something about Jake Morrison's straightforward manner that made it difficult to refuse him, and if she was honest, she was desperately curious about what he wanted to explain. The restaurant he chose was modest but clean, with checkered tablecloths and the comfortable bustle of working people enjoying their evening meal. Jake guided her to a corner table where they could talk without being overheard, then ordered for both of them with the ease of someone accustomed to making decisions. Now then, he said once the waitress had brought them coffee, I imagine you're wondering why a stranger would take such an interest in your employment situation. Victoria nodded, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. The thought occurred to me. Jake was quiet for a moment, his green eyes studying her face as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. I've been watching you for a few days, he said finally. Coming and going from the hotel, the way you carry yourself, the way you treat people. Victoria felt a chill of unease. Watching me? Not in any inappropriate way, Jake said quickly. My ranch supplies beef to the hotel, so I'm there regularly on business. I couldn't help but notice you, the way you work twice as hard as anyone else. The way you handle difficult customers with patience, even when they're rude to you." He paused as their food arrived, beef stew with fresh bread for both of them. Victoria realized she was genuinely hungry for the first time in weeks, not just mechanically eating to fuel her body for work. "I also couldn't help but notice," Jake continued carefully, "that you seem like someone who's had some hard knocks recently. Someone who's maybe far from home and trying to figure out where she belongs." Victoria's spoon stilled halfway to her mouth. "What makes you say that? The way you talked about your work being temporary. The way you flinch when people look at you too long, and—" He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was in the hotel lobby last week when that woman in the green dress made her comment about your appearance. I saw how it affected you." Victoria's face flamed with mortification. "You heard that?" "I did. And I've been angry about it ever since." Jake's voice was quiet but intense. "That woman doesn't know the first thing about you, about your character or your worth. She sees only what fits her narrow idea of what's acceptable." "But she wasn't wrong," Victoria said quietly, her appetite suddenly gone. "I am exactly what she said, coarse-looking, unsightly." Jake set down his spoon with enough force to rattle the table. "Don't you dare repeat that poison. You're a beautiful woman, Victoria Whitmore, with more strength and grace than any painted society lady could ever hope to possess." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Beautiful? Her? She stared at Jake in shock, searching his face for any sign of mockery or pity. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch: sincerity, admiration, and something deeper that she didn't dare name. "I don't understand," she whispered. Jake leaned forward, his voice earnest. "What don't you understand?" "That a man might see past society's ridiculous standards to recognize real beauty when he encounters it. That someone might value kindness and strength over the latest fashion." Victoria shook her head, overwhelmed. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I want to offer you something different," he said finally. "A chance to get away from people who don't appreciate what they have right in front of them. I don't understand. My ranch is about 15 miles outside of town. It's beautiful country, mountains and meadows, good water, peace and quiet. I run cattle, but I also grow vegetables and keep chickens. It's a good life, but it's a lonely one." Victoria's heart began to pound. "Mr. Morrison." "Jake," he corrected gently. "And hear me out before you say no. I'm not talking about anything improper. I have a housekeeper who lives in the main house, Mrs. Chun. She's been with me for 3 years. But she's getting older, and the work is becoming too much for her. I need someone to help with the household management, someone who can handle correspondence and maybe help with the books." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "The pay would be $20 a month, plus room and board. You'd have your own cabin, complete privacy, and the respect that should have been yours all along." Victoria stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You're offering me a job? Based on one conversation?" "Based on weeks of observation and one very telling conversation," Jake corrected. "I'm a good judge of character, Victoria. It's kept me alive in this territory for 15 years. And everything I've seen tells me you're exactly the kind of person I've been hoping to find." "But you don't really know me," Victoria protested weakly. "I could be anyone. I could be running from something terrible." Jake smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Are you running from something terrible?" Victoria thought of Boston, of Mrs. Pemberton's shop and the lonely room at the boarding house, of the false promise that had brought her west. "In a way, yes, but nothing criminal or shameful." "Then I'm not worried." Jake's voice was steady, confident. "What do you say, Victoria? Are you willing to take a chance on something different?" Victoria's mind raced. Leave Tombstone? Leave the safety of her job at the hotel? the routine she had worked so hard to establish. Trust a man she barely knew? But, as she looked across the table at Jake Morrison's earnest face, she felt something she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember: hope. Real hope, not the desperate fantasy that had brought her west, but the possibility of a genuine new beginning. "I need time to think," she said finally. Jake nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be in town for 2 more days, staying at the hotel. If you decide you're interested, you can find me there." As they finished their meal, Victoria found herself studying this unexpected man who had appeared in her life like a character from a story. He was nothing like Edmund Hartwell's letters had promised, no flowery phrases or grand declarations. Instead, he offered something far more valuable: straightforward honesty and genuine respect. When Jake walked her back to Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, Victoria felt the curious gazes of passers-by. But for the first time since arriving in Tombstone, she didn't shrink from the attention. Let them look. Let them wonder about the well-dressed rancher escorting the hotel's former laundry girl down the main street. "Thank you for dinner," she said as they reached the boarding house steps. "And for the opportunity. I'll give you my answer tomorrow." Jake touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both respectful and somehow intimate. "Until tomorrow then, Miss Victoria." As she climbed the stairs to her small room, Victoria's heart was lighter than it had been since leaving Boston. She had been offered a chance at something she had never dared to dream of, not just employment, but acceptance, respect, perhaps even the possibility of happiness. But could she trust it? Could she trust him? And more importantly, could she find the courage to take such a leap of faith when her last attempt at building a new life had ended in such devastating disappointment? Through her window, she could see the lights of Jake Morrison's hotel, and she wondered if he was thinking about their conversation, if he was as surprised by this unexpected turn of events as she was. Tomorrow, she would have to decide whether to remain safe in her small world or risk everything for the chance at something extraordinary. For the first time in her life, the choice was entirely her own. The journey to Jake Morrison's ranch began at dawn on a crisp Saturday morning, with Victoria seated beside him on the buckboard wagon, her few possessions secured in the back alongside supplies from town. She had given Mrs. Donovan her notice the evening before, a conversation that had surprised her with its warmth. "You're making the right choice," the hotel owner had said, counting out Victoria's final wages. "Jake Morrison is one of the few truly honorable men in this territory. He'll treat you with the respect you deserve." Now, as they traveled through the awakening desert, Victoria marveled at the transformation of the landscape. The harsh, dusty environment around Tombstone gradually gave way to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and ocotillo. The air grew cooler as they climbed in elevation, carrying scents of pine and sage that spoke of water and growing things. Jake proved to be an easy traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the territory's history. Without overwhelming her with chatter, he seemed to understand that she needed time to absorb this dramatic change in her circumstances. "That peak there with the snow on it, that's Mount Graham," he said, indicating a towering summit in the distance. "Gets cold up there even in summer. The Apache consider it sacred ground, and I can understand why. Makes a man feel small, but somehow more connected to something bigger than himself." Victoria studied his profile as he spoke, noting the genuine reverence in his voice. There was a depth to Jake Morrison that she was only beginning to glimpse, layers of character that revealed themselves in small moments like this. The ranch itself, when it finally came into view around midday, took Victoria's breath away. Nestled in a valley between gentle hills, it spread across the landscape like something from a painting. The main house was built of adobe and timber, with deep verandas that promised cool shade and views of the surrounding mountains. Outbuildings dotted the property, a large barn, corrals filled with horses, a bunkhouse for the ranch hands, and several smaller structures whose purposes Victoria could only guess at. But what struck her most was the sense of permanence about the place. This wasn't the rough, temporary feel of Tombstone, where buildings seemed thrown up hastily to serve immediate needs. This was a home built with care and intention, designed to last generations. "It's beautiful," she breathed, and meant it completely. Jake's face lit with pride and pleasure. "Been working on it for 12 years now. Every building, every fence, every tree I planted myself or supervised personally. It's not fancy, but it's solid." As they approached the main house, a small, energetic woman emerged from the kitchen door, wiping her hands on her apron. Mrs. Chun was perhaps 60 years old, with graying black hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her movements spoke of efficiency and capability, despite her advancing years. "So this is the young lady you told me about," Mrs. Chun said, looking Victoria up and down with frank appraisal. "Good, you look strong. This place needs someone with backbone." Jake helped Victoria down from the wagon, his hands steady and respectful. On her waist, "Mrs. Chun, meet Victoria Whitmore." "Victoria, this is Mrs. Chun, who keeps this place running better than any general ever managed an army." Mrs. Chun snorted at the compliment, but looked pleased. "Flattery will get you nowhere, Jake Morrison. Come, Miss Victoria, let me show you around while this one sees the horses." The main house was even more impressive inside than out. The rooms were spacious and comfortable, furnished with pieces that spoke of quality without ostentation. Windows were positioned to catch the mountain breezes, and Victoria noticed details that revealed a woman's touch: wildflowers in simple vases, books arranged on shelves, curtains that were both practical and attractive. Jake's mother planned this house, Mrs. Chin explained, as if reading Victoria's thoughts. "She died before it was finished, but he built it exactly as she designed it. Said she deserved to have her vision completed, even if she couldn't be here to see it." The revelation added another layer to Victoria's understanding of her new employer. A man who would complete a dead woman's architectural dreams was not the typical rough frontiersman she had expected. Mrs. Chin led her through the kitchen, a marvel of organization and efficiency, with a large wood-burning stove, ample counter space, and storage areas that spoke of careful planning. Beyond that was a small office where Jake apparently handled the ranch's business, its desk neat but obviously well used. "He tries to manage the books himself," Mrs. Chun confided, "but his handwriting is terrible, and he has no patience for details. Maybe you can help him with that." Victoria's cabin, when Mrs. Chun finally showed it to her, was a revelation. Located about 100 yards from the main house, it was small but perfectly appointed, with its own fireplace, a comfortable bed with a colorful quilt, a desk by the window, and even a small bookshelf stocked with novels and poetry collections. "Jake had this built specifically for you," Mrs. Chun said casually, as if constructing entire buildings for new employees was perfectly normal. "Thought you might like your privacy and independence." Victoria stared around the space, overwhelmed. "He built this for me? But how could he know I would accept his offer?" Mrs. Chun's expression grew knowing. "Jake Morrison doesn't do anything halfway. When he decides he wants something, he prepares for success, not failure. Besides," she added with a slight smile, "he was pretty confident you'd see the wisdom of his proposal." That first week on the ranch was a period of constant discovery and adjustment. Victoria quickly learned that a ranch life operated on rhythms entirely different from town living. Work began before dawn and continued until well after sunset, but it was varied and engaging in ways that hotel labor had never been. Her morning started with helping Mrs. Chun prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, a hearty meal of eggs, bacon, biscuits, and strong coffee that fueled the day's work. Victoria found herself enjoying the challenge of cooking for a dozen hungry men, learning to gauge quantities and timing to have everything ready simultaneously. After breakfast, she worked. With Jake in the office, tackling the mountain of correspondence and paperwork that had accumulated during his bachelor management. His handwriting was indeed atrocious, and his filing system consisted mainly of shoving papers into various drawers based on no discernible logic. "I'm not built for desk work," Jake admitted on her third day, watching in amazement as she organized months of invoices and contracts into comprehensible order. "Give me a difficult horse or a stubborn steer any day over account ledgers." Victoria found herself laughing, something that came more easily each day. "Then it's fortunate you hired someone who actually enjoys bringing order to chaos." The ranch. Hands were initially skeptical of the new housekeeper, particularly when they learned she had come from town. Cowboys, Victoria quickly discovered, had their own hierarchy and culture, with elaborate codes of behavior and respect that had to be earned rather than assumed. The crew was led by Tom Brennan, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked for Jake since the ranch's early days. He treated Victoria with careful politeness but obvious reserve, watching to see how she would handle the unique challenges of ranch life. Her first real test came during her second week, when a sudden thunderstorm caught several hands working on fence repairs far from the main buildings. They returned to the house soaked and chilled, looking forward to hot food and dry clothes. Victoria had anticipated their needs, keeping soup simmering on the stove and heating water for baths in the bunkhouse. "Ma'am," Tom said as she ladled steaming broth into bowls, "that's the best welcome I've had after a day like today in longer than I can remember." From that moment, Victoria sensed a shift in the men's attitude toward her. They began including her in their casual conversations, asking her opinion on practical matters, and treating her as an integral part of the ranch operation rather than a temporary addition. Jake, she noticed, watched these interactions with quiet satisfaction, as if her acceptance by his crew had been another test she had unknowingly passed. The work itself proved endlessly fascinating. Victoria learned to identify different breeds of cattle, to understand the complex logistics of moving herds between pastures, and to appreciate the delicate balance between conservation and profit that successful ranching required. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, explaining the reasoning behind his decisions and gradually including her in planning discussions. "You have a good head for this," he told her one evening as they reviewed shipping schedules for the spring cattle drive. "You see the connections between different parts of the operation, how decisions in one area affect everything else." Victoria felt a glow of pride at his words. In Boston, her intelligence had been tolerated at best, often seen as unfeminine and appropriate. Here, it was valued and utilized. That her relationship with Jake himself continued to evolve in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. He treated her with unfailing respect and courtesy, but Victoria began to notice moments when his gaze lingered on her face, when his hand touched hers longer than necessary when passing documents, when his voice grew softer during their evening conversations on the veranda. For her part, Victoria found herself studying Jake with growing fascination. She watched how he handled difficult situations with calm authority, how he treated his animals with firm kindness, how he could switch effortlessly from discussing cattle prices to debating the merits of different poets. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake shared more of his personal history. "I came out here when I was 22, he said, his voice reflective. "My father had died, left me a small inheritance that was just enough to buy land if I was willing to work it myself. I wanted to build something lasting, something that would matter. And you have," Victoria said softly. "This place is extraordinary." Jake turned to look at her, his green eyes serious. "It's been a good life, but a lonely one. I always thought that was enough, that I didn't need anything more than the work and the land. But these past weeks, having you here—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "It's made me realize how much I've been missing. Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. "Jake, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still finding your footing here, still deciding if this life suits you. I don't want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. But I need you to know that what I feel for you goes beyond appreciation for your work." Victoria stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You mean that, truly?" "I've never been more serious about anything in my life." Jake's voice was steady, confident. "You're remarkable, Victoria. Your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, I see it all, and I value every bit of it." The words washed over Victoria like a benediction, healing wounds she had carried for so long that she had forgotten they could stop hurting. To be seen, truly seen, for who she was rather than what others expected her to be, it was a gift beyond price. "I care for you too," she admitted quietly. "More than I thought possible after such a short time. But Jake, I need you to understand, I'm not the kind of woman men typically choose. I'm not delicate or decorative. You're perfect, Jake." Interrupted firmly, "Exactly as you are. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Victoria felt something she had never experienced before, the sense of being exactly where she belonged. The desert night surrounded them with its vast peace, and for the first time since leaving Boston, she allowed herself to believe that her future might hold happiness beyond her wildest dreams. Mrs. Chun's voice calling them in for a late supper broke the spell, but as they rose to go inside, Jake caught Victoria's hand in his. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For taking a chance on this place, on me. For being brave enough to trust again." Victoria squeezed his hand gently. "Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked right through me." As they walked toward the warm light spilling from the kitchen windows, Victoria marveled at the transformation in her life. 6 weeks ago, she had been a desperate woman stranded in a strange town with nothing but shattered dreams. Now she was part of something real and growing, something that might just become the love story she had always hoped for but never dared to expect. The desert had tested her and found her worthy. More importantly, Jake Morrison had looked past society's narrow standards and seen the woman she truly was. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Victoria knew she had finally found her place in the world. 2 months had passed since Victoria's arrival at the ranch, and autumn was painting the Arizona mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The rhythm of ranch life had become as natural to her as breathing, and her relationship with Jake had deepened into something that felt both exciting and comfortably inevitable. They had not yet spoken explicitly of marriage, but the understanding hung between them like a promise waiting to be voiced. It was on a crisp October morning that their peaceful world was shattered by the arrival of trouble in the form of Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy cattle baron from Phoenix whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud. Victoria was working in the office when she heard the thunder of hooves in the yard, followed by raised voices that carried an undertone of menace. Through the window, she watched Jake emerge from the barn to meet 3 mounted men. The leader was a tall, imposing figure in an expensive black suit, his silver hair gleaming beneath a spotless hat. Even from a distance, Victoria could sense the arrogance in his bearing, the way he looked down at Jake from his horse as if surveying conquered territory. "Morrison," Blackwood's voice carried clearly across the yard, smooth as silk but with steel underneath. "I trust you've given consideration to my previous offer." Jake's stance was relaxed but alert, like a man prepared for trouble. "I told you before, Blackwood. The Copper Creek Ranch isn't for sale at any price." Blackwood's laugh was cold and calculating. "Everything has a price, my friend. It's simply a matter of finding the right leverage." His gaze swept across the ranch buildings with proprietary interest. "This is beautiful land, perfect for expansion. My investors are very interested in acquiring properties with water rights in this region." Then they'll have to look elsewhere, Jake replied firmly. This land stays in my family. Your family? Blackwood's tone grew mocking. Last I heard, you were a bachelor with no heirs. What family are you protecting, exactly? Victoria saw Jake's shoulders tense, and she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. There was something in Blackwood's manner that suggested this. Conversation was far from over. The tension escalated throughout the day as Blackwood's men made themselves conspicuously present around the ranch boundaries, ostensibly checking survey markers but clearly establishing a threatening presence. Tom Brennan reported that they had been questioning the ranch hands about water sources, cattle counts, and the financial state of the operation. Boss, Tom said quietly to Jake as they stood in the barn that evening, these men aren't just here to talk business. They're gathering intelligence, looking for weaknesses. Jake nodded grimly. I know. Blackwood's been buying up small ranches all over the territory, usually after the owners encounter a series of unfortunate setbacks. Drought mysteriously affecting only certain properties, cattle disappearing, accidents happening to key personnel. Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. You think he's planning to force you to sell? I think Marcus Blackwood is used to getting what he wants, and he doesn't much care about the methods required. Jake's jaw was set in a hard line. But he's underestimated what he's dealing with here. This ranch means everything to me, and I'll defend it with my life if necessary. The first direct attack came 3 days later when Victoria was alone at the main house while Jake and the hands were checking cattle in the far pastures. She was preparing the midday meal when Mrs. Chun burst through the kitchen door, her usually composed face pale with alarm. Miss Victoria, come quickly. There's smoke coming from the hay barn. Victoria dropped her stirring spoon and raced outside, her heart hammering as she saw thick black smoke billowing from the large storage building that held the winter feed for the cattle. Without that hay, the ranch would face disaster when the harsh mountain winter arrived. Get the buckets from the well, Victoria shouted to Mrs. Chun, already running toward the barn. I'll try to get the doors open and see how bad it is. The fire had started in the back corner of the barn, where it would be least visible from the main house. Victoria could see immediately that this was no accident. The flames were too concentrated, too deliberately placed. But there was no time to analyze the situation. The hay was going up like tinder, and every minute of delay meant more of their precious winter supply would be lost. Working with desperate efficiency, Victoria and Mrs. Chun formed a bucket brigade from the well to the barn, fighting to contain the blaze before it could spread to the entire structure. The work was brutal, the buckets were heavy, the smoke was choking, and the heat was intense enough to singe eyebrows and hair. When Jake and the hands finally arrived, drawn by the smoke visible from miles away, they found Victoria and Mrs. Chun still battling the flames, their faces streaked with soot and their clothes singed from flying sparks. Victoria! Jake's voice was raw with panic as he leaped from his horse and raced toward the barn. Get away from there! We've almost got it contained, Victoria called back, not stopping her frantic work with the water buckets. Just a few more minutes. The men joined the effort immediately, and together they managed to save roughly half of the stored hay, enough to see the cattle through winter if they were careful with rationing. But the message was clear. Blackwood was escalating his campaign. As they stood surveying the damage in the smoky aftermath, Tom Brennan pointed to hoofprints in the soft earth near the back of the barn. 3 horses, boss. Came in from the north ridge where they couldn't be seen from the house. Jake's face was grim as he studied the evidence. Professional work. They knew exactly where to set the fire for maximum damage with minimal risk of being caught. That evening, as Victoria tended to the burns on her hands and arms, Jake sat beside her on the veranda, his expression troubled. This is my fault, he said quietly. I should have seen this coming, should have taken better precautions. Victoria looked up from wrapping a bandage around her wrist. How could you have known? You're not responsible for Marcus Blackwood's criminal behavior. But I am responsible for keeping you safe, Jake replied, his voice heavy with guilt. When? I asked you to come here. I never imagined I might be putting you in danger. Jake Morrison, look at me. Victoria's voice was firm, commanding his attention. I'm not some helpless flower that wilts at the first sign of trouble. Today proved that I can handle whatever this place throws at me. Jake's expression softened as he looked at her soot-streaked face, her determined eyes, her bandaged hands that spoke of courage under fire. You were magnificent today. The way you fought that fire, protected Mrs. Chun, saved half our winter feed. I've never seen anything braver. Then stop treating me like I need protection from reality, Victoria said. We're in this together. Whatever comes next. The next phase of Blackwood's campaign began the following week with the systematic theft of cattle from the outer pastures. The thefts were carefully planned, small numbers taken from different areas, making it difficult to detect the losses immediately. But Jake's careful record-keeping revealed the pattern within days. 43 head missing so far, he reported to Victoria and Tom during an emergency meeting in the office. All prime breeding stock, taken from areas where the loss wouldn't be noticed right away. The buyers in Tucson won't ask questions if Blackwood shows up with cattle bearing altered brands, Tom said grimly. By the time we could prove theft, the evidence would be long gone. Victoria studied the ranch map spread across Jake's desk, her mind working through the logistics. What if we concentrated the remaining cattle in the pastures closest to the house? It would mean more work moving them to water, but they'd be harder to steal without being seen. Jake nodded slowly. It's risky overgrazing the near pastures could damage them for next season. But losing more cattle would be worse. The decision proved wise when Blackwood's men attempted another raid 2 nights later, only to find the targeted pasture empty. Tom and 2 other hands, hidden in positions overlooking the area, watched the frustrated thieves circle the empty field before retreating into the darkness. But Blackwood's most dangerous move came a week later, targeting not the ranch's resources but its people. Victoria was returning from Tombstone, where she had gone to purchase supplies and arrange for additional feed to replace what had been lost in the fire. She was driving the loaded wagon alone along the winding mountain road when 3 masked riders emerged from the rocks ahead, blocking her path. Well, well, said the lead rider, his voice muffled by a bandana but his threatening intent clear. If it isn't Morrison's lady friend, you've caused our employer quite a bit of trouble. Miss. Victoria's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. I don't know what you're talking about. Please move aside and let me pass. Oh, we'll let you pass, the man said with a harsh laugh. But first you're going to deliver a message to your boyfriend. Tell him Mr. Blackwood's patience is running thin. Tell him accidents can happen to anyone, even pretty ladies who don't know when to mind their own business. The threat hung in the air like poison, but Victoria surprised herself by feeling anger rather than fear. These men thought they could intimidate her, force her to become a weapon against Jake. They had gravely underestimated her resolve. I'll deliver your message, she said coolly. But you should know that threatening me was a mistake. Jake Morrison doesn't respond well to cowards who hide behind masks and threaten women. The lead rider's eyes narrowed dangerously above his bandana. Maybe you need a lesson in respect, lady. He spurred his horse forward, clearly intending to frighten her, but Victoria was ready. She had learned to handle difficult situations during her weeks on the ranch, and more importantly, she had discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. As the rider approached, Victoria suddenly cracked the wagon whip with expert precision, the leather tip catching the man's hat and jerking it from his head, along with the concealing bandana. The horse shied at the sharp sound, nearly unseating its rider, while Victoria got a clear look at his face, a scarred weather-beaten visage she committed to memory. "Back off," she commanded, her voice ringing with authority as she brandished the whip. "I know who you are now, and if anything happens to me, Jake will know exactly who to come looking for." The man's companions were laughing at his undignified struggle to control his spooked horse, and his face flushed red with humiliation and rage. But Victoria's threat had found its mark. He clearly didn't want his identity known. "This isn't over," he snarled, pulling his hat back on. "You tell Morrison he's got 1 week to reconsider Blackwood's offer. After that, things get serious." The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared back into the rocks, leaving Victoria alone on the mountain road with her racing heart and shaking hands. But as the immediate danger passed, she felt something unexpected, a fierce pride in how she had handled the confrontation. When she reached the ranch and told Jake what had happened, his reaction was explosive. "They threatened you?" His voice was deadly quiet, more frightening than any shout. "They put their hands on you." "They tried to intimidate me," Victoria corrected. "But I think I gave as good as I got. Jake, we can't let them win through fear. That's exactly what Blackwood wants." Jake paced the office like a caged wolf, his hands clenched into fists. "This has gone too far. When they started targeting the ranch, that was business. But threatening you—" He turned to face her, his green eyes blazing. "Victoria, I need you to go back to town. Stay at the hotel until this is settled." "Absolutely not." Victoria's response was immediate and firm. "I'm not running away when you need me most." "This isn't about running away. It's about keeping you safe." "And what about keeping you safe?" Victoria shot back. "What happens to this ranch if something happens to you? What happens to Mrs. Chun and the hands and everything you've built here?" Jake stared at her, clearly torn between his protective instincts and his recognition of her practical point. "Besides," Victoria continued, her voice softening, "you said yourself that we're stronger together than apart. I'm not leaving you to face this alone, Jake Morrison. We're partners in this, whether you like it or not." The word partners hung between them, carrying implications that went far beyond their current crisis. Jake's expression gradually shifted from angry protectiveness to something deeper, more complex. "Partners," he repeated slowly. "Is that what we are?" Victoria met his gaze steadily. "That's what I want us to be. In everything. For as long as you'll have me." Jake crossed the room in 3 quick strides, pulling her into his arms with gentle urgency. "Victoria Whitmore, you are the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Brave and stubborn and absolutely impossible to argue with. Is that a yes to the partnership?" she asked, her heart soaring as she looked up into his face. "That's a yes to everything," Jake replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Partners, lovers, husband and wife if you'll have me. But first we end this thing with Blackwood, together." As they stood in each other's arms, planning their strategy for the confrontation to come, Victoria marveled at how completely her life had transformed. She had come west as a broken woman seeking rescue, only to discover that she was capable of being someone's partner in the truest sense, not just in the good times, but in the battles that tested everything they had built together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who saw her strength instead of her flaws. Ready to fight for the future they were building together. The standoff with Marcus Blackwood had reached a dangerous crescendo when an unexpected complication arrived at the Copper Creek Ranch in the form of a telegram that would force Victoria to confront the life she had left behind. The message, delivered by a nervous young writer from town, bore the seal of the Western Union office in Boston and contained news that made Victoria's blood run cold. "Miss Victoria Whitmore," she read aloud to Jake in the privacy of the office, her voice trembling slightly. "Your presence urgently requested. Boston. Mrs. Pemberton, gravely ill, has named you sole beneficiary of seamstress shop and personal effects. Please return immediately to settle estate matters. Signed, Attorney Jonathan Whitfield. Jake looked up from the ranch ledgers he had been reviewing, his expression immediately shifting from business concentration to concern. Mrs. Pemberton, that's the woman you worked for? Victoria nodded, sinking into the chair across from his desk. She was more than an employer, really. When my parents died, she was the only person who showed me any kindness. She gave me work when I had nothing, taught and me skills that kept me from starving. Her voice caught slightly. I always meant to write to her, to explain what happened, but I was so ashamed of how I left ... You had every reason to leave, Jake said firmly, coming around the desk to kneel beside her chair. You were chasing a chance at a better life. She would understand that. But I abandoned her without a word, Victoria replied, the old guilt weighing heavy on her heart. She must think I'm ungrateful, irresponsible. And now she's dying, and she's left everything to me, despite how I treated her. Jake took her hands. In his touch warm and steadying. So what do you want to do? The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a simple trip to Boston. Victoria had built a new life here, found love and purpose and a sense of belonging she had never experienced before. But she also had debts to the past that couldn't be ignored. I have to go, she said finally. I owe her that much at least. But Jake, the timing with Blackwood threatening the ranch will still be here when you get back. Jake interrupted gently. And so will I. Mrs. Pemberton was important to you, Victoria. You'd never forgive yourself if you didn't. Say goodbye. 3 days later, Victoria found herself once again on a stagecoach, this time heading east instead of west, carrying with her a small valise and a heart full of conflicted emotions. Jake had insisted on escorting her as far as Tucson, where she would catch the train to Boston, despite her protests that he was needed at the ranch. Tom can handle things for a few days, he had said, dismissing her concerns. Besides, I want to make sure you get on that train safely. Blackwood's men might see your departure as an opportunity. The journey to Tucson passed in a blur of desert landscape and quiet conversation. Jake seemed to sense her internal turmoil, and made no demands on her attention, content to sit beside her as she watched the familiar landmarks of her new life disappear behind them, at the train station. As they waited for the eastbound locomotive, Jake pulled her aside for a private moment. Victoria, I need you to know something before you go, he said, his green eyes serious and intent. Whatever you find in Boston, whatever obligations or opportunities present themselves, I want you to feel free to make the choice that's right. For you, I don't want you to feel trapped by what we've built here. Victoria stared at him in shock. You think I might not come back? I think, Jake said carefully, that you left Boston as one person and you're returning as someone completely different. You might find that your old life has more to offer than you remembered. And if that happens, if you decide to stay, I'll understand. The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. After everything they had shared, after the partnership they had forged and the love they had declared, did Jake really believe she could simply walk away? Jake Morrison, she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. I am coming back. This ranch, this life we're building together, it's everything I've ever wanted. Nothing in Boston could change that. Jake's expression softened, relief flickering in his eyes. I had to say it, Victoria. I needed you to know that you have a choice, that you're not bound to me by circumstance or gratitude. I'm bound to you by love, Victoria replied firmly. And that's not changing, no matter what I find in Boston. The train journey east was a strange reversal of her westward trek months earlier. Then, she had been running toward an uncertain future with desperate hope. Now she was traveling toward a known past with reluctant duty. The other passengers were a mix of businessmen, families, and adventurers. many of them heading east after trying their luck in the Western Territories. Victoria found herself the object of curious stares and whispered conversations. She had changed dramatically since leaving Boston. Her skin was tanned from outdoor work. Her hands bore the calluses of honest labor, and most noticeably, she carried herself with a confidence that transformed her entire presence. She was no longer the timid, apologetic woman who had fled eastward desperation months before. Boston, when she finally arrived after the grueling cross-country journey, struck her as impossibly crowded and gray after the open spaces and brilliant skies of Arizona. The air was thick with smoke and industrial odors, the streets clogged with carriages and pedestrians, the buildings pressing close together like prison walls. Mrs. Pemberton's shop was located in the same narrow building Victoria remembered, squeezed between a bakery and a haberdashery on a side street in the merchant district. But the bright Pemberton's fine sewing sign that had once hung proudly above the door was now faded and barely legible. Inside, the shop felt smaller than Victoria's memory suggested, the workspace cramped and poorly lit compared to the spacious ranch house where she had grown accustomed to working. Mrs. Pemberton herself was a shadow of the brisk, energetic woman. Victoria remembered her hair now completely white, her face gaunt with illness, her hands too frail to manage the delicate needlework that had once been her pride. But her eyes, when they fell upon Victoria standing in the doorway, still held their old spark of intelligence and warmth. "Victoria, my dear child," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You came. I wasn't sure. Victoria rushed to her former employer's bedside, tears flowing freely as she took those fragile hands in her own strong ones. "Of course I came, Mrs. Pemberton. I'm so sorry I left without explanation. I was—" "Hush," the older woman interrupted with a weak smile. "You were chasing your dreams just as you should have been. I only hoped you found what you were looking for." "I did," Victoria said softly. "More than I ever dared to hope for." Mrs. Pemberton's eyes studied Victoria's face with the keen perception that had always made her such an excellent judge of character. "Yes, I can see that you did. You look fulfilled, my dear, happy in a way you never were here." Over the next few days, as Victoria helped care for her former mentor and began sorting through the complex affairs of the shop, she gradually learned the full scope of Mrs. Pemberton's generous bequest. The seamstress had indeed left Victoria everything: the shop, her personal savings, her small apartment above the workspace, and most surprisingly, a substantial collection of valuable antique sewing equipment and rare fabrics that would be worth a considerable sum to collectors. "She always spoke of you as the daughter she never had," explained Attorney Whitfield during their meeting to review the will. "Even after you disappeared so suddenly, she refused to believe you had abandoned her callously. She was convinced you had good reasons for leaving." The monetary value of the inheritance was staggering to Victoria, enough to live comfortably for years, enough to return to Arizona and buy her own ranch if she chose, enough to transform her from a dependent employee into an independent woman of means. But it was not the money that shook her most profoundly. It was the reactions of the people who had known her before. Word of her return spread quickly through the tight-knit community of merchants and artisans who had formed her world in Boston. Many came to pay their respects to Mrs. Pemberton and to satisfy their curiosity about Victoria's transformation. The contrast between their memories and her current reality was stark enough to generate considerable comment. "My goodness, Victoria," gasped Mrs. Hamilton, the baker's wife who had always treated her with barely concealed condescension. "You look so different, so confident and healthy. The Western air must agree with you remarkably well." Even more telling was the reaction of Dr. Richard Thornton, a prominent physician who had once courted one of Victoria's fellow seamstresses and had made his contempt for Victoria's appearance abundantly clear during that time. "Miss Whitmore," he said, arriving at the shop ostensibly to pay his respects but clearly driven by curiosity. "I must say, your time in the territories has been remarkably transformative. You seem quite robust." The word robust was delivered with a particular emphasis that made it clear he intended it as a compliment, though a rather backhanded one. Victoria realized with a mixture of amusement and irritation that Dr. Thornton was actually attempting to flirt with her, something that would have been unthinkable during her previous life in Boston. The most unsettling encounter came when Victoria was approached by Mr. Charles Whitfield, the attorney's nephew and a prosperous merchant who had inherited several dry goods stores throughout New England. He appeared at the shop on her 4th day in Boston, ostensibly to discuss potential business arrangements, but clearly motivated by more personal interests. "Miss Whitmore," he said, removing his hat with elaborate courtesy, "I hope you'll forgive my boldness in calling upon you during such a difficult time. But I wanted to express my admiration for how you've handled this challenging situation." Charles Whitfield was everything that society would consider an ideal suitor: wealthy, well-educated, handsome in a conventional way, and possessed of impeccable social credentials. He was also, Victoria realized with growing discomfort, exactly the sort of man who would never have noticed her existence during her previous incarnation as a struggling seamstress. "You're very kind, Mr. Whitfield," Victoria replied politely, continuing her work of sorting through Mrs. Pemberton's fabric collection. "Please call me Charles," he said, moving closer to examine her work. "I must say, your business acumen in organizing this estate has been most impressive. A woman with such practical skills and resources would make an excellent partner for someone in my position." The proposal, thinly disguised though it was, hung in the air like an unwelcome odor. Victoria looked up from her work to find Charles studying her with the calculating gaze of a man evaluating a potential investment. "Mr. Whitfield," she said carefully, "I'm afraid you may have misunderstood my situation. I'm not looking for a business partnership or any other kind of arrangement. I have a life waiting for me in Arizona." Charles's expression shifted to one of patronizing concern. "My dear Miss Whitmore, surely you're not planning to return to that wilderness. You have an opportunity here to establish yourself in proper society, to build a respectable life among civilized people. The frontier is no place for a woman of your obvious refinement." Victoria set down the bolt of silk she had been examining and turned to face him fully. "Mr. Whitfield, that wilderness has given me more happiness and purpose than I ever found in civilized society. I'm returning to Arizona because that's where I belong." "But consider what you'd be giving up," Charles pressed, clearly unwilling to accept her refusal. "Security, comfort, social standing. Surely whatever rough attraction drew you west initially has worn thin by now." "The attraction," Victoria said with growing firmness, "is love, Mr. Whitfield, real love, from a man who values me for who I am rather than what I might bring to a business arrangement." Charles's face flushed with embarrassment and something that might have been anger. "I see. Well, I hope this frontier paramour of yours appreciates what a fortunate man he is, though I do hope you'll reconsider before making such a permanent mistake." After he left, Victoria sat alone in the quiet shop, surrounded by the remnants of her old life, and marveled at how completely her perspective had changed. 6 months ago, Charles Whitfield's proposal would have seemed like a miracle: security, respectability, escape from the grinding uncertainty of her daily existence. Now it felt like a prison sentence, a return to a world where she would be valued only for her utility and expected to be grateful for the privilege. As she sat beside Mrs. Pemberton's bedside in the small apartment above the shop, Victoria shared the story of her Western adventure with her dying mentor. She spoke of Jake, of the ranch, of the challenges they had faced, and the love they had discovered. Mrs. Pemberton listened with the rapt attention of someone living vicariously through another's tale, her eyes bright with interest despite her physical weakness. "He sounds like a remarkable man," she said when Victoria finished. "And you sound like a woman who has finally found her true home." "I have," Victoria confirmed. "But Mrs. Pemberton, I feel so guilty about leaving you. If you had stayed, you would have spent your life wondering what might have been," the older woman interrupted gently. "My dear child, seeing you now, seeing the woman you've become, is the greatest gift you could have given me. You're radiant with happiness and purpose. That's worth more than any amount of dutiful attendance on a sick old woman." Mrs. Pemberton passed away peacefully 2 days later, with Victoria holding her hand and whispering stories of Arizona's sunsets and mountain meadows. The funeral was well attended by the merchants and artisans who had known her, and Victoria found herself accepting condolences from people who treated her with a deference that was entirely new in her experience. As she prepared to return west, Victoria realized that she had been fundamentally changed by this journey back to her past. Not by the inheritance or the social opportunities that had been offered to her, but by the clarity that came from seeing her old life through the lens of her new one. She had come to Boston as Victoria Whitmore, former seamstress and abandoned mail-order bride. She was leaving as Victoria Whitmore, partner to Jake Morrison and co-owner of the Copper Creek Ranch, a woman who knew her own worth and refused to settle for anything less than genuine love and respect. The train that carried her west bore a woman who had been tested by the past and found her future wanting nothing in comparison. She was going home, not to the place where she had been born, but to the place where she had been reborn. The train that carried Victoria back across the continent seemed to move with agonizing slowness, each mile stretching like an eternity. As her anxiety about the situation at the ranch grew with every passing hour. She had been gone for 3 weeks, during which Marcus Blackwood could have escalated his campaign against Jake and the Copper Creek Ranch to devastating effect. Her fellow passengers noticed her restlessness, the way she stared out the windows as if willing the locomotive to move faster, the way her hands clenched and unclenched in her lap whenever the train made one of its interminable stops for water and coal. She carried with her not only Mrs. Pemberton's generous inheritance, which had been converted to bank drafts sewn carefully into the lining of her traveling coat, but also a deeper understanding of her own strength and the certainty that she was returning to where she truly belonged. When the train finally reached Tucson, Victoria's heart leaped as she spotted a familiar figure waiting on the platform. But it wasn't Jake as she had hoped. It was Tom Brennan, the ranch foreman, his weathered face grave with concern and something that looked disturbingly like relief at seeing her. "Miss Victoria," Tom said, touching his hat brim as she stepped down from the train car. "Thank God you're back safe." "Tom, what's happened? Where's Jake?" He's alive," Tom said quickly, seeing the panic in her eyes. "But there's been trouble, bad trouble. We need to get you back to the ranch as quickly as possible." The wagon ride from Tucson to the ranch was the longest journey of Victoria's life as Tom filled her in on the events of the past week. Blackwood had indeed escalated his campaign, but not in the ways anyone had anticipated. Instead of more cattle theft or property damage, he had played a far more sophisticated and dangerous game. "He went to the territorial authorities," Tom explained, his voice tight with anger. "Filed claims saying Jake's water rights were fraudulent, that the original survey markers had been moved, that the ranch was actually on government land that should be open for homesteading. Complete lies, but backed up with forged documents and bought testimony." Victoria felt ice form in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "It means federal marshals showed up 4 days ago with papers giving Blackwood's men the right to occupy the disputed areas while the claims are investigated. They've set up camps on our best grazing land and are preventing us from accessing the main water sources. But surely Jake has the original deeds, the proper documentation." "He does. But Blackwood's lawyers are claiming those are forgeries. The territorial judge is either bought or intimidated. and he's ordered all parties to maintain the status quo until a federal commissioner can review the case. That could take months, and meanwhile, our cattle are cut off from water. As they approached the ranch, Victoria could see the evidence of the crisis immediately. The normally green pastures nearest the house were brown and dusty, dotted with cattle that looked thin and stressed. Smoke rose from several camps visible on the distant hills. Blackwood's men, claiming squatters' rights on land that had been Morrison property for over a decade. Jake emerged from the main house as the wagon pulled into the yard, and Victoria's heart clenched at the sight of him. He looked older, worn down by stress and sleepless nights, his face gaunt with worry. But when he saw her, his expression transformed with such profound relief and joy that she felt tears spring to her eyes. Before the wagon had even come to a complete stop, Victoria was climbing down and running toward him. Jake caught her in his arms, holding her tight against his chest as if afraid she might disappear again. "You came back," he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "I told you I would," Victoria replied, pulling back to cup his face in her hands. "Jake, Tom told me what's happening. How bad is it really?" Jake's expression grew grim as he led her into the house, where Mrs. Chun was waiting with coffee and the kind of substantial meal that spoke of concern for Jake's declining appetite. "It's as bad as it gets without open warfare," Jake admitted, settling into his chair at the kitchen table with obvious exhaustion. "Blackwood has effectively stolen half our ranch using legal maneuvers instead of guns. We can't move cattle to the water sources, can't access the salt licks, can't even repair fences in the disputed areas without his men claiming we're trespassing on federal land. What about fighting it legally? Surely there are honest judges, lawyers who would take the case. With what money?" Jake's laugh was bitter. "Blackwood has unlimited resources and connections throughout the territory. The kind of legal fight this would require could take years and cost more than the ranch is worth." Victoria studied his face, seeing the defeat there that cut her more deeply than any of Blackwood's previous attacks. This was a man who had poured his life into building something lasting, only to watch it being stolen through corruption and manipulation. "There might be another way," she said quietly. Jake looked up, hope flickering in his tired eyes. "What do you mean?" Victoria rose from the table and went to her traveling coat, carefully opening the hidden seam to reveal the bank drafts from Mrs. Pemberton's estate. "I have money now, Jake. Enough to hire the best lawyers in the territory, enough to fight Blackwood on his own terms." Jake stared at the documents in her hands, then slowly shook his head. "Victoria, I can't let you spend your inheritance fighting my battles. That money represents your security, your independence." "Our battles," Victoria corrected firmly. "And my security is here with you, on this ranch. What good is independence if I lose everything that matters to me?" But even as they discussed legal strategies, Victoria could see that Jake's spirit had been broken by the sustained assault on everything he had worked to build. Blackwood's campaign had been designed not just to steal the ranch, but to crush the man who owned it. The next morning brought a new development, when a rider arrived bearing an ultimatum from Marcus Blackwood himself. The message was brief and to the point. Jake had 48 hours to accept a generous payout offer for the ranch, or Blackwood would file additional claims that would tie up the property in legal proceedings for years, while the cattle died of thirst and the buildings fell into ruin. "He's not even trying to hide his extortion anymore," Tom said angrily as Jake read the message aloud. "He knows the system is rigged in his favor." Victoria listened to the discussion of their limited options with growing frustration. Every suggestion legal, appeals, political pressure, media attention would take time they didn't have while the ranch deteriorated around them. Finally, she stood up from the table with sudden decision. "I'm going to see Blackwood myself." The statement brought immediate protest from both Jake and Tom, but Victoria held up her hand for silence. "Think about it," she said. He's expecting Jake to come to him as a defeated man, begging for mercy. He's not expecting to face a woman with the resources to cause him real problems. And more importantly, he doesn't know me. I might be able to catch him off guard. Jake's face was pale with worry. Victoria, this man is dangerous. He's already threatened you once. He threatened the ranch woman with no power or resources, Victoria replied. I'm no longer that woman. Against Jake's wishes but with his reluctant agreement, Victoria set out for Tombstone the next morning, dressed in her finest traveling dress and carrying herself with the confidence that came from both love and substantial financial backing. She had a plan, risky though it was, that could either save the ranch or destroy them all. Marcus Blackwood was holding court in the finest suite at the Grand Hotel when Victoria arrived, surrounded by lawyers and territorial officials who had clearly been bought or intimidated into cooperation. He received her with the amused condescension of a man who considered himself far above the concerns of frontier women. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising from his chair with elaborate courtesy. "How unexpected. I trust you've come to discuss Mr. Morrison's unfortunate situation." "Actually," Victoria said, settling into the chair across from him with calm dignity, "I've come to discuss your unfortunate situation." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "I'm afraid I don't understand." Victoria opened her reticule and withdrew a sheaf of papers, placing them carefully on the table between them. "These are copies of federal land surveys, Mr. Blackwood, the original surveys, conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers 15 years ago. They clearly show that every inch of the Copper Creek Ranch is legally surveyed and deeded private property." "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying." "I'm implying that you've committed federal fraud by filing false claims on surveyed land," Victoria continued smoothly. "I'm also implying that you've bribed territorial officials to ignore legitimate property rights, which is a federal crime punishable by prison and forfeiture of assets." Blackwood's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "These are serious accusations, Miss Whitmore. I hope you have evidence to support them." "As a matter of fact, I do." Victoria withdrew another set of documents. "These are sworn affidavits from 3 of your former employees, detailing your instructions to file false claims and your payments to Judge Henderson for favorable rulings. They were quite willing to testify in exchange for immunity from prosecution." The bluff was audacious and completely fabricated, but Victoria delivered it with such calm certainty that even Blackwood's lawyers began to look nervous. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "I've arranged for these documents to be delivered to the territorial governor, the federal land commissioner, and the attorney general's office in Washington. Unless, of course, we can reach an alternative arrangement." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, his calculating mind clearly working through the implications. "What kind of arrangement did you have in mind?" "You withdraw all claims against the Copper Creek Ranch immediately. You compensate Mr. Morrison for the cattle lost and the property damage suffered during your campaign. And you remove yourself and your operations from this territory permanently. And in return? In return, I don't destroy you." Victoria's voice was quiet, but carried the absolute conviction of someone prepared to follow through on every threat. "I have the resources to fight you in every court in the country, Mr. Blackwood. More importantly, I have the connections to ensure that your business practices receive the kind of federal attention that tends to be very bad for men in your position." The room was silent for a long moment as Blackwood weighed his options. Finally he spoke, his voice tight with controlled rage. "You've made a dangerous enemy today, Miss Whitmore." "No," Victoria replied, rising from her chair with serene dignity. "I've revealed that you already were one. The difference is that now you know I'm prepared to be just as dangerous in return." 3 days later, Marcus Blackwood's camps were gone from Morrison land, his legal claims withdrawn, and a substantial bank draft had been delivered to the ranch as compensation for damages. The territorial governor, apparently eager to distance himself from any potential federal investigation, had personally assured Jake that his property rights would be protected going forward. Jake stood in the doorway of the main house, watching the last of Blackwood's men disappear down the road, hardly able to believe that the nightmare was finally over. "How did you do it?" he asked Victoria as she joined him on the veranda. "Blackwood isn't the type to back down without a fight." Victoria smiled, slipping her arm through his. "I convinced him that fighting me would cost more than it was worth. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to prove you can be a bigger bully when necessary. Remind me never to get on your bad side," Jake said with a laugh that held genuine awe. That evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Jake took Victoria's hand in his. "There's something I need to ask you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "Something I should have asked long ago." Victoria's heart began to race as Jake slipped from his chair to kneel beside hers, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "Victoria Whitmore," he said, his green eyes shining with love and gratitude. "You've saved my ranch, stood by me through the worst crisis of my life, and proven yourself the strongest, bravest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Will you marry me? Will you be my partner in everything for the rest of our lives?" The ring was simple but beautiful, a single diamond set in gold that caught the last rays of sunlight like captured fire. But it wasn't the ring that brought tears to Victoria's eyes. It was the look on Jake's face, the absolute certainty in his voice, the knowledge that she was loved completely for exactly who she was. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, with joy spilling over. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I will marry you." 6 months later, Victoria Morrison stood in the garden behind the main house, watching her husband direct the ranch hands in preparations for the spring cattle drive. Her wedding ring caught the morning sunlight as she absently touched her still flat stomach, where their first child was growing. The Copper Creek Ranch was thriving under their joint management, expanded with the addition of new breeding stock purchased with her inheritance. More importantly, it had become a refuge for other women who found themselves stranded or abandoned in the harsh frontier town's mail-order brides whose intended husbands had failed to materialize, widows with nowhere to go, young women fleeing impossible situations. Victoria's story had spread throughout the territory, becoming a legend of sorts among those who understood what it meant to be judged by appearance rather than character. She had proven that strength came in many forms, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that a woman who knew her own worth could overcome any obstacle. As Jake approached her across the yard, his face lighting with the smile that was reserved only for her, Victoria marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come west as a desperate woman seeking rescue, only to discover that she was capable of being the rescuer herself. The curves that society had mocked had become symbols of strength and resilience. The heart that had been broken by false promises had healed to love more deeply than she had ever imagined possible. And the spirit that had been crushed by others' expectations had risen to claim a destiny entirely her own. In the end, Victoria Morrison had found something far more valuable than the conventional happiness she had originally sought. She had found a love that celebrated her exactly as she was, a life that challenged and fulfilled her, and the knowledge that she was strong enough to protect everything that mattered to her. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and possibility across the ranch, and Victoria smiled as she went to meet her husband, ready for whatever adventures their future might hold. 5 years had transformed the Copper Creek Ranch into something that surpassed even Jake's original vision. What had once been a solitary man's refuge had become a thriving community, a beacon of hope for those seeking second chances in the unforgiving Arizona territory. Victoria Morrison stood on the wraparound porch of the expanded main house, watching her 3-year-old daughter Emma chase chickens in the yard, while her infant son slept peacefully in the cradle beside her. The morning sun painted the familiar mountains in shades of rose and gold, a sight that never failed to fill her heart with gratitude for the life she had built here. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention to the main road, where a dusty stagecoach was making its way toward the ranch. Victoria smiled, recognizing the weekly arrival that had become as regular as clockwork, another group of women, seeking sanctuary and new beginnings at what locals had begun calling Morrison's Haven. This week's arrivals included a young widow from Colorado with twin boys, a former schoolteacher from Kansas whose own mail-order marriage had ended in disaster, and a woman roughly Victoria's age whose story remained unspoken, but whose bruised face told its own tale of escape from violence. Mrs. Chen, now assisted by two younger women who had themselves found refuge at the ranch, emerged from the kitchen to greet the newcomers. The system they had developed over the years ran with clockwork efficiency, immediate medical attention if needed, a hot meal, clean clothes, and most importantly, time to heal and decide what came next. "Mama, look!" Emma's delighted squeal interrupted Victoria's observations as the toddler successfully cornered a particularly stubborn hen. The child was a perfect blend of her parents' Jake's green eyes and dark hair, Victoria's determined chin and fearless spirit. "Very good, sweetheart," Victoria called back, then turned as familiar footsteps approached from inside the house. Jake emerged onto the porch, their son Michael cradled in his arms while he reviewed a letter that had arrived with the morning mail. 5 years of marriage and parenthood had only deepened the love between them, their partnership evolving into something even stronger than either had imagined possible. "News from Washington," Jake said, settling into the chair beside Victoria's. "The territorial legislature has officially recognized our Women's Refuge program. They're offering funding to help expand the operation." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Official government recognition? Are we becoming respectable?" Jake's laugh was warm and genuine. "God forbid. Though I suspect your reputation as the woman who faced down Marcus Blackwood has something to do with their sudden interest in supporting us." The defeat of Blackwood had indeed become legendary throughout the territory, inspiring other communities to stand up against corruption and intimidation. The cattle baron himself had disappeared from Arizona entirely, his business empire crumbling under federal investigation that Victoria's threats had indeed triggered through her carefully cultivated connections in Boston. "There's other news, too," Jake continued, his expression growing more serious. "Remember Sarah Martinez, the young woman who stayed with us last spring?" Victoria nodded, recalling the 17-year-old who had fled an arranged marriage to an abusive man 3 times. "Her age. She went to California, didn't she, to stay with her aunt?" "She did. And according to this letter, she's now enrolled in a teacher's college in San Francisco. She says the confidence she gained here gave her the courage to pursue her education." Jake's voice carried the quiet pride of a man who had discovered that his life's greatest meaning came not from personal success, but from enabling others to find their own. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the yard, where Emma had been joined by the twin boys from the morning's arrival. Already, the careful barriers that trauma had built around the newcomers were beginning to soften in the face of innocent play and unconditional acceptance. Victoria's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Tom Brennan, now the ranch's general manager and one of the most respected men in the territory. His weathered face carried news that immediately commanded attention. "Boss, you're going to want to see this," Tom said, holding up a telegram. "It's from the railroad company. They want to build a spur line through our property, connecting Tombstone to the main line. They're offering serious money for the easement rights." Jake and Victoria exchanged glances, both understanding the implications immediately. The railroad would bring unprecedented prosperity to the region, but it would also bring the kind of rapid development that could destroy the peaceful sanctuary they had created. "What do you think?" Jake asked Victoria, already knowing that any major decision would be made together. Victoria looked out over the ranch, at the gardens where the women grew vegetables and flowers, at the workshops where they learned trades that could support them independently, at the small school building where children from dozens of different backgrounds played together without judgment. "I think," she said slowly, "that we need to be very careful about the terms. The railroad could help us reach more women who need sanctuary, but not if it destroys the peace they come here to find." Over the following weeks, Victoria threw herself into negotiations with the railroad representatives with the same strategic brilliance she had once used against Blackwood. The final agreement she crafted would allow the rail line to pass through a carefully selected portion of the ranch, while establishing the rest as a permanent refuge protected from future development. The substantial compensation would ensure the program's financial security for generations, allowing them to help even more women rebuild their lives. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, the Copper Creek Ranch hosted its first annual gathering, a celebration that brought together women from across the territory who had found new lives through their programs. Former guests returned with their children, their new husbands, their business successes, their teaching certificates, their nursing diplomas. Victoria moved among them during the evening festivities, marveling at the transformation in each face. There was Martha, who had arrived beaten and broken, but now ran a successful bakery in Phoenix. There was Ruth, who had used her time at the ranch to learn bookkeeping, and now managed accounts for 3 businesses in Tucson. There was young Sarah, home from California for the celebration, radiant with the confidence that came from pursuing her dreams. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Victoria was approached by a shy young woman who looked achingly familiar. "Mrs. Morrison," the woman said nervously, "I don't know if you remember me. I'm Catherine Walsh. I arrived here about 2 years ago, right after my intended husband in Denver turned out to be a fiction," Victoria finished gently, recognizing the pain that she herself had once carried. "I remember, Catherine. You stayed with us for 3 months. Catherine's face lit up with joy. "Yes. And I wanted you to know I'm getting married next month. To a wonderful man who loves me exactly as I am. But more than that, I wanted to thank you for showing me that I was worth loving." As the evening wound down and their guests departed for their homes throughout the territory, Victoria and Jake sat together on their porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gotten off that stage in Tombstone?" Jake asked, his arm around her shoulders as she leaned against his warmth. Victoria considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But then I remember that every wrong turn, every disappointment, every moment of pain was necessary to bring me here, to this life, to you. I wouldn't change any of it. Even Edmund Hartwell's betrayal." "Especially that," Victoria said with conviction. "If he had been real, if he had met me at that depot, I would have spent my life settling for someone who saw me as convenient rather than cherished. I would never have discovered my own strength." Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Have I mentioned lately that I'm grateful every day that he was a coward?" Victoria laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful ranch where dozens of women slept safely, many for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new arrivals seeking hope, new opportunities to prove that love could triumph over society's cruelest judgments. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, Victoria Morrison was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, surrounded by the life they had built together, secure in the knowledge that her story had become a beacon of hope for countless others. The mail-order bride who had once been mocked for her curves had become a legend in her own right, not for conforming to others' expectations, but for refusing to accept anything less than the love and respect she deserved. In finding her own worth, she had created a place where others could discover theirs. And in the end, that was the greatest transformation of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.